go. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of ASCII Anything, brought to you by Moser Consulting. I'm Tim Mack, your guest host for this episode. This is part two of a three-part discussion with Moser expert John Murphy on healthcare data modeling, interoperability, and governance. Today's episode covers UDMH organization and reference data management and enterprise data implementations.
Again, I've mentioned it's a suite of three models, and I picked this. This is an IBM picture of their that they use in used to use in marketing, and it tells three really important stories all at the same time. The IDA stuff. IDA is a modeling tool. The IDA content is the data modeling products that are delivered with UDMH. There's a business model. It's a non-deployable model that is just a set of a model, visual representation of the concepts within healthcare, the relationship of those concepts to each other, and a definition of the kinds of types of things you would see in the healthcare space. It's easily the biggest model of the three of them. It has 60-ish thousand entities, just the nature of a fifth normal form model, a business model, a conceptual model, right? I pick on this model for two reasons. One is that's the context and the grain of data representation you want in a governance catalog, right? So if you notice, there is a governance platform up here for the business terms and the analytical requirements. The business terms in the governance platform are the business terms in the business model. There is an encounter in there. Oh, and by the way, there's an inpatient encounter. There's an outpatient encounter. There's all the data elements in an encounter. There's a patient. There's a mother. There's a child. There's a clinical order. There's a pharmacy order. All of those are terms within the business model and terms within the business terms section of a governance platform. Those are not technical terms. I forget what it's called in knowledge catalog. And I forget, to tell you the truth, I forget what it's called in Purview off the top of my head. But there is always a catalog of business terms that you can then identify the thing as a PII piece of data, as a certain kind of diagnosis. There was always extra protections put around transactions that included diagnoses of AIDS and psychiatric issues, right? That we protected that data extra securely. That's part of the governance tooling capability. It needs a catalog to work against. That's the catalog. So that's the business data model. And the business data model also very explicitly tells you exactly what's in your business. The other two models are relatively abstract. The business data model is very explicit. That's why it makes good content for the business terminology catalog in a governance tool. Two other lines that are important here is the line between the business model, the atomic model, and the business model, the dimensional model. Those two models were derived directly from this business data model. All of the elements in the business that were described in the business data model are in the atomic model and the dimensional model. The atomic model is what we use for core warehouses. It's a normalized model. It's not great for reporting. It's not as awful as everybody says it is. I'm a big fan of Data Vault, by the way. About 80% of my work was in Data Vault, so I spent all my time in the atomic model. Everybody else in the universe works in this reporting, analytics, and other space, this dimensional model. That is good Kimball, Data Mart, and other sorts of representations like that for analytical purposes. The base content of that is derived from the atomic model. The analytical components are derived from both the business model and the atomic model components. And the analytical pieces of the dimensional model are the seed for the analytical requirements representation in the governance catalog. As I said, the HEDIS standard was represented in the UDMH model. That's represented in our governance catalog as a piece of data related to the business terminology, both from a dimensional standpoint. Here's what patients defined as, down to the measure. I measure requirement XYZ, is this over that? Well, this and that are both terms. And the this over that is also a term. All of that's recorded in the analytical requirements piece of the governance platform. So this UDMH model, it's obsolete, but there's a mechanism, and you can do this however your tooling allows you to do it. There's a mechanism for taking that terminology that is just HL7, FHIR, 837, etc., migrating it into a catalog, organizing this as analytical requirements. What do I want to measure by what? This is what do I want to measure by analytical requirements. Making terminology out of that, relating the terminology however it needs to be within your data governance space, right? So UDMH, obsolete product, was used to derive the content for a governance catalog that has got a lot of powerful things for it. But really what people want out of this is databases. So the Atomic Warehouse is a core data warehouse. So this is how you implement them into data stores. And AI and big data and the like hasn't changed the story significantly. How it gets deployed technically in the background, I don't care about. I'm technology agnostic, right? Will contain a relational warehouse that looks an awful lot like a data vault in the core warehouse. I will create a series of reporting structures out of that in my data marts, my OLAP layer. How old is that screen, right? My AI engines, right? This is what AI wants to consume. Somebody said earlier, and I'll tell a personal story. The reason I worked for Moser is I worked for IBM as a contractor up through 2015, right? And in Watson, IBM Watson, which is a marvelous tool. And this is not picking on Watson. This is picking on salespeople. Walks up and says, "Just feed me healthcare data. I don't care what it is. We'll make sense out of it because that's what we do. We're smart." Nonsense, right? What AI needs you to do is send them good cleaned up data, curated data, right? Professionally curated data to healthcare standards, compliant to security and the like, and then we can do magic with it. AI tools don't do magic with garbage any more than any other tool does magic with garbage. So what this is enabling, this interoperability, what you're doing, and one of the questions we'll answer later is on the quality side. I've given you a conformed model, a series of conformed models. We know what the data is supposed to look like in these models, how it's supposed to behave, whether we are crossing a line of a prohibition, whether we haven't met all the requirements for doing X yet. It gives us the ability to determine all that. It is a precursor. This curated stuff is a precursor to proving that the data we're creating is quality, is secured, is master data managed, is effectively managing its reference data, right? So that story on the right is really the value proposition for UDMH.
So, John, I have a quick comment to make and then a question. So, you've mentioned
Yep,
HEDIS on the last two slides. So, we need to tell everyone that's healthcare effectiveness data and information set. And it's a standard to
yeah,
look at performance of healthcare that any
yep,
organization that's providing it can share that data and have it. And then the other question I had, you went into a little bit of detail here with the governance platform and the IDA about privacy, and I'm assuming you're going to be consent at this point too, because you mentioned
yep.
PII and PHI data. Is that platform the way that you've derived it? Is that really the business terms and those things? You're driving that governance for security based on that design. Is that a correct assumption, or do you want to give more details about that?
The the across the architecture we do, right? So consent, for instance, is a subject area in UDMH, right? So as we're doing studies and need consent for healthcare services to be provided, we do record that. That's a table and a series of tables actually in UDMH, right? So our consent engines that need to verify all of that have that data, raw data to verify to. The question around data security, PII, and all of that is the question of does the tooling tag data as PII? There's nothing intrinsic about a column called name is PII. It could be a drug name. It could be a whatever. If name happens to be on the person table, it's PII. So the tooling needs to be able to tag that the data we want to be PII as PII data. The HIPAA and GDPR and standards like that, health information portability, and I forget what the second A stands for. It's the one that
Accountability,
describes
accountability and
accountability.
portability.
Yeah, there you go. I forgot. I always forget the second A. Describes what we need to do with data that can either be directly personally identified or if you have a series of data together, it's enough to assume that that person is as an individual. It described both of those requirements. We need to tag that data in a modeling tool in the database and in the governance tools, and they all three of those interact together as PII. And then your database, your applications and the like need to be compliant to using that identification of PII and the like and know what to do with it. But it's on the governance side to describe that's a business question. Is this PII? Yes. Right. So we need to do certain things with it in the application and in the database. That is a governance question. And the two tools that I'm going to talk about today do support that sort of tagging and, identifying and storing the data known to be PII. The model itself helps in that a lot of the PII data is normalized. We have a name table, we have an address table, right? So we can either turn off the relationship between those things and a data, like a patient table, or we can mask that data as necessary, right? So the normalizations you see in the model do help that some. But a lot of anymore, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, that can be done at an element level on a database table, right? So the normalization is just to support data complexity. One of the things it used to do is kind of enable that sort of security too, but anymore the engines can get very specific about the data they need to, but we need to tag that data. That's the question. That's a question for this process, yes. And both tools do support it.
Yep, and I would agree with you. It's all about tagging the data, and then you can use whatever tool you need to deal with it at that point. Because
Yeah,
you're right, all the databases, all the flavors support that today, whereas 10, 15 years ago, they didn't.
right. It used to be a really big deal. And now it's kind of both baked into the models, and we've kind of gotten past that a lot of our data definitions, right? Yeah.
Yep.
So again, one of the things I wanted to focus on, I've been focusing on here, not is not the technical capabilities of all of the stuff. A data model is a data model, right? It's a table related to another table, and then you do that 60,000 times, and you have a story to tell. Here's the story we tell. The UDMH content, again, largely based on HL7 FHIR and 837, accounts for 70% of this set of subject areas. We support the ADT transactions and lab interactions and pharmacy definitions and managing prescriptions from the prescription to can I use a generic, right? To the point of dispense. Did I dispense what I ordered? All of we have analytics built in for all of that, but the models will store what was actually prescribed, what was actually pulled off the table and put off the shelf, the dispense, and then what was actually put into the patient. Those are three different HL7 messages, and we store that data. We stored parties and facilities and locations, a bed versus a building versus a lab, is big in the healthcare facilities management, if you would. As you might imagine, we have patients, we have encounters, we have persons and plan members. This is a unified model. It is used by both payers and providers. And my last three clients, well, yeah, all three of my last three clients were what we call payviders. The new thing in the United States is for either healthcare providers. My last client was a provider that started a payer company essentially for certain populations. But previous to that, both of my previous clients to this were payers that had bought into clinics essentially. So they were providing services, they were creating encounters and patients and the like, but they were doing in management of their plan members, right? So there's clearly a relationship between a plan member, a person, and a patient. And there are three very different concepts in this model. Person is I always pick on role player. Person is the holy grail of analytic data. I want to know my complete healthcare history and outcomes. The unfortunate part of this, and this, you always want to manage projects, you want to get the low-hanging fruit. This is fruit at the top of the tree. Identifying a person with just the data that EHR systems have across healthcare providers. In Indianapolis, we have St. Vincent's, we have IU Methodist, and we have Community in St. Francis, right? Four different healthcare. And I've been to all four of them. What's my history of that healthcare across those four systems? It's hard, it's almost impossible to get enough quality data around my patient demographics to know that I'm the same person with certainty across those four healthcare systems. So person is a profoundly complicated thing to do in healthcare. Therefore, you're a lot of the time stuck with a payer is recording the history of a person while they're a plan member with that payer. And the hospital systems are recording my history as me as a patient for them. But those are three different concepts. We support all three. All three of them are related to everything in the model. So based on the nature of the data you have, you can deploy your model with one, two, or all three of those concepts related to the transactional data in the rest of the model. But if you don't see anything in healthcare in here, I'd be a little surprised. We do even include things like the HIPAA permissions, and that's the only one that would have an analytical bent to it in here, I think. So this is the basic business content of UDMH, basic business content of the knowledge catalog accelerators in IBM's data governance catalog. This is what data they are governing. Now I get to go out into that tool and say, yeah, patients PII data, encounters PII data. person's PII data, plan members' PII data. Usually things like the diagnosis. Diagnosis here is not a diagnosis code. It's not an ICD-9 code. It's an ICD-9 code assigned to me at a point in time. I have cancer. I have high blood pressure. I have whatever I have, right? That's a diagnosis for me. It doesn't take a rocket science to turn that diagnosis into an identification of who's being diagnosed, right? So that's considered PII data. That's the sort of thing we need to manage within a governance tool. But this is the data we govern it. And this is all derived from the business data model, the same grain. We'll end up this conversation with what does 6-month roadmap look like for implementing UDMH? Well, this is a lot of 6-month roadmaps, right? This is not a 6-month project to do this. My last client had 4 teams. It was clinical. It was basically the ADT life cycle, clinical orders, claims, and a team I didn't get to deal with. And there was some sort of AI, big data, a learning team, a discovery team. And I don't know, I forget what they were, but that's 40% of this model, right? That's not supply chain. It's not a lot of the other, it's not surgery. So it's about 40% of this model. That was a 4-year project. So I'll point it out when we get into our life cycle. Pick your scope for the first 6-month project pretty carefully because you can get lost in the woods here. This is a very complicated, very relational, very important, very sensitive. Pick all your bad terminology, the things that increase risk in a project. This is all of them. Right. So pick your scope correctly.
I say it's the old adage, how do you need an elephant? 6 months at a time for this
Yeah,
model.
You start with the left leg, then the right leg. Yeah, exactly. Right. And that just everything in healthcare is the extreme of every adage you ever had. And somebody asked me why, boy, you look at all this chaos. Why do you enjoy that? I said, because it's challenging, right? So if you can do this, you can do anything. Right? This is great fun, this sort of work. But you have to be ready for iterative processes because you don't do this all at once. So one of the things, and I will go out to the model to show you this. One of the things that's nice, brilliant about UDMH, I implemented, but I didn't define this, but we have a set of structures defined in our dimensional warehouse model that is a representation of standard reporting, regulatory, quality sorts of measurement that you would do within healthcare. My last client was a national healthcare client that had 150 hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. They're going to do eventually all of this. They're probably already doing all of this. What they want to be able to do is do this from one enterprise data architecture. And so do we deploy this? And this is Tim's elephant question. That's the whole reason we're doing all of this is to do this sort of analytics, reporting, compliance, analytics, and that sort of work. If you're in healthcare, do you recognize this? Yes. HEDIS. I pick on HEDIS. And I don't know what the acronym stands for, so thank you, Tim. The HHS, actually, I picked on the wrong one. Somewhere in here is regulatory reporting. There's an NHS set of reporting in here. Every one of my American clients explored and deployed some of that stuff. That's the National Health Service of Britain, right? IBM, this model is developed in Ireland. I was working remote from that team since 1990. This is a worldwide model. Does what the NHS measure for a certain kind of behavior, is it useful to understand that? Every one of my clients thought so. Was it one of their requirements? No, but it was. They understood the story that it could tell, the analytics, the learning they could do from that measurement. So they said, thanks for the tip. And they went off and started to look into deploying that sort of thing. But these are the what we call business solution templates in the model, which turn into, there's a terminology they use in the glossary tool, business performance indicators. All right, so this is a video, and there's a URL at the end of this, I think that points to this video. So it's publicly available. I'm not tacking into anything that IBM doesn't want you to see. These are the things in the glossary that they have defined, right? So it's a pretty useful, and this is 2/3 of the way through the video. They've shown you how they take a term, map it to associated terms, map it to the elements that define that term, and then they map it to these business performance indicators. So if I need to know how, my diabetes population from my ACO is dealing, there's a diabetes analytics in here and disease management that will tie back to plan members of patients that have a diagnosis of diabetes that had a clinical finding, yay or nay, right? And that's what we're measuring. That's all going to be mapped between this set of terminology that is analytical back to the terms that are necessary to either give context to the measurement or to derive the measurement itself. Do I need to buy this tool? No, you don't need to buy this tool. Again, I love this tool. This is a roadmap, same roadmap that they used, you can use incrementally to get to what you need to do in your measurement and analytics and reporting and learning sets. So the roadmap is the same. Do it to your scale. Buy this tool, whatever it costs. It is what it is. I don't know what the cost is on this stuff, but there's a lot of work behind this, so it's a valuable tool. And tell your story within the standard plot lines that everybody in the healthcare industry has to be able to tell, right?
I was going to say, John, I think one of the things that you've hinted at and talked a little bit through here, and I think we just kind of got to that point, is you really got to have good data governance to trust the data that you're going to try to drive model and other analytics out of. So if you're not doing that work on the front end, you're going to be doing it here and spending more time getting to trusted data if you haven't done that right.
Right.
So
Right.
be
So yeah. As I said earlier, one piece of the data governance is reference data management, 20,000 codes out of 60,000 data elements. Yeah, right. So again, you have to understand my bias and experience to this thing is I dealt with the National Health Service of Britain, Scotland, actually. I've dealt with, national health facilities. So my original client for this was a national group purchasing organization. I think in terms of interstate scales to these things. If you are a clinic on the north side of Indianapolis that is contracting to IU Health, and you have to do security compliance reporting, and you have to do patient satisfaction, which is part of HEDIS reporting, you're going to need to do this yourself, and you need to build processes that do reference data management, that have patient conformed, that have visit conformed, that have clinical orders and findings conformed, right? So it's hard, even at the smallest of scales, to do this without a data governance capability. And so let's tell that story and how we deal with that, both generally and how these pieces that were talked about, FHIR, HL7, and UDMH support this integration, allow us to deploy it, help us accelerate the scale that this stuff is and the complexity this stuff is. First of all, healthcare has a unique number of universal and commercial standards. That's good, right? That's not good, it's required, right? You cannot do this at any scale without being able to two people talk in a language that they can at least translate into a common language. HL7, FHIR, 837, all the drug standards, even NDC, right? The standard diagnosis codes, the standard condition codes in SNOMED, the standard border codes in LOINC, the standard procedure codes in CPT, right? And all of those things. This complexity won't be managed without that. The good news is everybody knows them, or else they're not doing this business, right? So we have solved 60% of the complexity management problem just because that's true. I think the number's that big. You don't do data governance in this space without tapping hard into these standards, right? In fact, I think it's definitional, especially if you're doing claims, right? Back to, you're not going to get paid by CMS if you're not submitting an 837. It's a compliant thing. So most commercial software products allow us to understand how their data behaves relative to these standards. Great. That's part of the 60% accelerator that we have in these things. Epic needs to talk to my data warehouse. Well, how does it extract an ADT message? How does it define a patient and a visit, a diagnosis for that patient, a procedure done on the patient, an order made for the patient? That will tell us how to build my patient table and my encounter table and my order table and my diagnosis table, and also how to relate all of those things together. Standards, good, right? That's my caveman talk for the day. Standards are good. And what amplifies that is because that's true, everybody that does business on these systems has somebody in-house that knows. And so if I need to build a clinical order table and I want to understand how it relates to my visit table or my plan member table, which isn't in part of these systems, I now have to understand how to cross-reference things from patient to plan member. My IT people, my business analysts, my SMEs, my subject matter experts will know how they've dealt with those things to create claims from this stuff, to create reporting that they've done already. There's institutional knowledge for these things that you have got to tap into. It does accelerate the mapping. Once you map something to an encounter, the next time you need to do that from some other system is going to be repeatable. It's pretty straightforward. So knowing you have technical people in-house also allows you to build a skill set in-house when you need to move data into a message structure, into a messaging hub, into an ODS, into a core warehouse, into a reporting structure, into a data lake that will allow my AI tools and the those sorts of tools to how to do that, right? Because we have people that are familiar with these standards in-house. So I put the screen on here to kind of reinforce the fact that UDMH, HL7, FHIR doesn't change the process. It accelerates the process. You need to scope the project. We have something like 80 subject areas in the UDMH model. Good luck getting that done by next Tuesday. So the first thing you have to do, and you have to be very sober about this and very intentional about this, is to describe what either is low-hanging fruit that you think you can get done quickly to prove value. Never forget to prove value, or something that's so crushingly important that we have to get to it now. Basic question: what do I want to measure, and what do I want to measure it by? To tell you how much I think this hasn't changed over the years, that's from a book that Kimball wrote in like 1995. So I think doing analytical structures in that story I was telling you about Watson telling everybody they can take whatever data. The reason I didn't work for IBM anymore is these core warehouse projects I work on, which does conform data, which does create predictable data, which does clean the data. Watson told everybody they didn't need it. My projects dried up. I went from very busy to very not busy in weeks in like 2015, 16, and it didn't work. So we're back to get used to and get back to the basics, right? What do I want to measure and what do I want to measure it by? Or what area of healthcare business do I want to better manage? Even if I don't know what I need to measure about my cancer population, if I know I want to manage my cancer population, I take a core warehouse attitude about this. I don't scope my data around patients and encounters and orders. I just scale my project to enable me to pull in all the data that I can tell an experience story of my cancer patients. And whatever that means is what I need to scope my project to. I need to get enough resources. I need to get enough people. I need to get enough hardware, software, licensing. I need to get that in place to do that healthcare business that I want to better manage. Right? I might not like the answer to that, but if I have a problem with my healthcare experience with my cancer business, that's my next project. And it's going to cost whatever it costs. And then what you do is just map the source to target. And I say later on what tools I like to have in place or experience with. This is done in Excel. The answers that you generate out of this stuff, I want to map this source column to that term, to that target term, is something that you then record in the governance catalog as an answer to a question on how am I mapping these two systems. I'm still in the place where I do my mapping in Excel, and I figure out how to migrate normally automatically, somehow ingest that into my governance catalog tools. There's a pretty strong ingestion capabilities. But I start with my target system. I'm sorry, I start with my source system. It's the only thing I know. I don't know what my patient table needs to look like from this system. I know it's going to look an awful lot like HL7. This is not drag and drop. There will be extra elements I need to extend my concept with. There will be new kinds of relationships between the entities, right? So this is true mapping. All I've done is accelerate the process. I have a rich set of data defined around my patient, a rich set of data around my encounters, a rich set of data around my clinical orders. I have a great starting place. That's just an accelerator. I still need to make the story in my target data store tell the story that I need to do my what do I want to measure it by, what do I want to measure it by. That's not a drag and drop. That's still modeling. What it does is it defines the target. Now I know what my target database is going to look like. It defines my final model deliverable. Then I do the data modeling. I take all these new columns and I put them in my model and I do all my new relationships and I create my whatever DDL is looking like these days. That's my traditional thing out of a data model. So I create my data store. Once I have the data store, I need to know how to load the data store. So I flip my modeling and I do what I call a target to source. Starting with my target model, I have these 15 columns I need to tell a story with. And I know they're all supported by my source system. Oh, no, by the way, I have these 5 technical columns, start date, end date, key, right? Business key, things like that, that are in my target model. How do I populate those? That's what this does for me. It's also done in Excel largely, but it's an instruction set for my ETL, ELT, using the term inclusively, all of the things I need to code to migrate data. It's the instruction set for how to transform my source data into my target data. The mapping starts with a newly extended target model. My UDMH model has been extended. It's got an extra 10 columns in the patient table. And that counts for the technical data and it's part of the ETL logic. Then I go and record all of this mapping in the metadata tool. And if I've scoped this rationally, I've added 150, I've accounted for 150 new source columns. Adding even manually 150 terms into a data governance catalog and mapping them to my target database is a fairly trivial exercise. It is critically important. The scale of these healthcare projects won't work without all of this stuff being known to the metadata governance tool, the governance catalog. Try not to be flippant here when I say your world hasn't changed. What your world has been improved, right? I shouldn't say it hasn't changed. The process is the same. The process is just now quicker. You can do more or you can do the same quicker. You can do more in the same amount of time or the same amount of work in less time. And you have these key cornerstone components to the security management, the reference data management, the master data management, data quality management that both Purview and Knowledge Catalog support. So that last step is where the rest of this governance really is enabled. Any questions at this stage, Mr. Tim?
I was going to say, it sounds like that on that previous slide where you were talking about mapping and spending the time there, that's really how you're going to drive your data quality and trust the data you're getting. Like you can't
Yeah, right.
overlook this stuff, that this really is critical to success on the next step.
Yep. Yep. Right. This is well, I guess you can't select the line, but that four first bullet point and then source to target map, you're capturing transformations that you know, right? So I have a Canadian system. I have one of my vendors is Canadian. They use this date format. I have to transform the data format, date format, right? This system uses RX norm drug definitions. Ouch, because I use one of the other ones. They change every week, and I don't even know another one. What's that mean? Well, I'll start with the NDC code. Everything revolves around NDC code. Use the standard, right? So I can transform it and I can describe the mechanisms to transform the drug data from the source systems context to this other context of my systems drug or my standard enterprise drug system. Yeah, that's exactly right. So all of that information is in notes columns in Excel. It's stored in the governance, the instructions and other notes you can do in the governance tooling. Yeah, that's exactly right. This is the discovery phase, right? This is where I'm discovering all that and recording my discoveries. That's exactly right. Watson, notwithstanding, you still have to do this. You still have to give, this is where you conform your data, right? So yes, your patient means this, and the orders that I've done in the context of Loink do mean that, right? I can tell it your AI tools and your learning tools and the other stuff exactly and predictably, right? Predictably that what this data story is telling you. I said before, in the context can be lost sometimes. I do almost all of my work at the core warehouse level. I don't care how people use this data. I just care what the data is, right? That's the whole universe I play in. And I've lost a lot of arguments these days about people not deciding to do core warehouses, and they really get stuck in later terminology. But the thing about data vaults is they force a conformance to your data. And that's an enabler. That you don't lose data, you don't do anything. It's a fundamental data enabler. And that's a good point. This is where you do all of that discovery and all of that capability building.
I was going to say, lessons learned for everybody out there. Zip code is only a number in the United States. In other parts of the world, it is not just numbers.
Yep.
So
Phone
put that in your
numbers.
data governance.
Yeah, and phone numbers. Again, this is an international model. It's a string because in some countries it's 8, 9, 10, 12 characters as a string. Some countries force the plus at the beginning. Some countries don't allow the parentheses on the area code, et cetera. Yeah, so all of that is what you decide and map and note in this mapping from source to target and target to source. The ETL people need to know what this data needs to look like and how it all relates, right? And the four in the first bullet point. Very powerful, concise instructions is the primary enabler here. That notwithstanding, there's people that do international analytics know how to deal with that stuff. Sometimes it's this and sometimes it's that. It's all in the same column of data, right? Okay, I can do this with it. We know what to do with that data, but we know the data has to be in a certain format to do those sorts of procedures on them, right? To do those data analytics and quality and just data utilization capabilities need this sort of conformance and predictability and quality to the data. And all of this enables that. From a data governance standpoint, the nice thing about this too is I've certified finally after all these years there's a data management certification I certified on last year. And there's 7 chapters to it. And healthcare analytics and interoperability projects need to address all 7 of the chapters I think it's 7 chapters, in that CDMP definition. Data quality, data security, data management teams, right? The organization around data management, reference data management, master data management, AI and machine learning. That standard deals with that at a relatively high level. So there's a lot of digging into it from there, but this doesn't change that. It accelerates that. It's the same story over and over again. The standards enable us to manage the complexity. They accelerate projects. They give us a conformity to definitions and understanding context. And that is not useful. That is a requirement. There's so much complexity to healthcare data and what we do with the healthcare data that from a data management standpoint and from an implication of healthcare outcomes from this data. It is, again, complex and big. It's just fun to deal with this level of effort because there's always something to do tomorrow, right? So, and you do have to remember what you did yesterday. So there's a lineage to this it's just a blast to work with. Any data implementation needs the whole gamut of data governance activity. And I'm going to deal with these 4 right now, mostly because they came up as a specific question, or there's a specific implication to that piece of the data governance in healthcare data. And again, the one I picked on first because it's unusual in its scale and scope in healthcare data is reference data management. There's a lot of codes. Master data management. This gets us into PII and all of those things and GDPR. I'm going to get that wrong forever. Having to forget us in a system. It's a sensitive data. If you're in Europe and you want to be forgotten on an analytical system, you get to be. So now I need to know what data to forget, right? So there's master data management. Data quality. If I get healthcare data wrong, give the wrong results and the like. I worked at a healthcare facility and our red line in the sand for whether we had to work overnight or not, will this kill somebody? Using this data wrong, having the wrong data, having the wrong story to tell will kill people, right? So there is a data quality requirement here that isn't like the data quality requirements in almost any other business. That's why security and the like tracks that same level of urgency. This is important data and it's complex data and there's a lot of data. There's a volume of data. So this is why healthcare data is fun. We get to do all of this. We get to do a lot of all of this, right? So I'll pick on reference data management first, right? So UDMH, this is a saying I came up with once because I've been doing data integration for so long. The only hard part of data integration is integrating the data. I can take an encounter and move it to another encounter and pull it off other systems. But to make sense out of it is hard to do. And the only reason it's hard to do is because I have to conform and standardize the codes. I need to know that the Epic encounter status is the same as the Cerner encounter status, is the same as my claim encounter status, right? So I can do claims on encounters that are still ongoing. And the only thing that makes conforming codes hard in the context of healthcare is there's so many of them. And sometimes there's many code sets for the same concept. If you take drug codes outside of NDC, there are commercial packages that manage drug interactions and drug orders and drug definitions, right? RX norm and the like. They are all trained on the National Drug Code from the FDA, but that doesn't make drug code management easy across systems. One system might use ARC because there's a lot of codes and there's a lot of things you do with a code. Can I replace this drug on an order with another drug? Is a drug replacement prohibited? Is there an interaction between 2 drugs? There's a whole application in pharmacy to deal with what did I order versus what did I put in somebody's arm as I did the pharmacy give, right? And the volume is staggering. So we have a generic structure within UDMH. HL7 and FHIR do a weird level of defining codes. They just say the thing is a code, and they give you a table to define the code, but nowhere in any of my HL7 implementations do I ever see that they put the code set in that code table, right? So there's a visit status, encounter status. Okay, there's an encounter status table. You populate the encounter status element on the whatever the PV1 segment encounter status is. But they don't give you the values for that. But the hard part of code management is conforming the values, right? So we have a model, and I don't want to show the model because I've been accused of showing the model to people and showing how we did the data solution, and apparently that's not a thing. But we have a common code table. It's defined in the Unified Standard Code subject area in the data model. And what it is, there's 5 tables, and I'll do the arithmetic again in my head. There's a code domain and a code table, a common code domain and a common code table. And what the domain is the set of codes we're talking about. An agreement status for your health plan is different than an encounter status, is different than an order status, right? So we have 3 different code domains there. Gender, race, they're all enumerated code sets. They're a code. And in the model, every code, whether or not it's got other data to it other than the name value pair within a domain, is modeled into the common code table. So if I need to look up a drug code, the code is going to be the NDC code. The domain is going to be drug code, right? And I can populate my data tables with the reference to the drug code. Now, there's another piece to this model, what we call complex codes, where all of the other data around the drug code is stored. So if I need to get into drug analytics around the NDC code, I can go out to that data and get it. But for something like a race code, C for Caucasian, A for Asian, etc., is a name value pair. That's a common code. Everything that's enumerated value goes into that table. And what that does for us is it allows us to conform the code, right? That common code table has been through a process we took, and I don't know if I remember if I pull it out on this screen or not, but we have a thing called the tenant common code from the source system, from Cerner, that gives us an encounter status, and Epic that gives us an encounter status. If it's a different value, we decide what value we want to be the enterprise within my enterprise, within this data store, what I want the set of accepted encounter codes are. That's my enterprise common code. That's my unified standard code. There's a tenant common code table that links to the domain. So I know it's still an encounter status domain table that has a bridge table to the common code table. So the Cerner value of X means X in my common code table, as does the Epic Y happens to translate into what I want X to be in my enterprise. So there's a bridge table between the tenant set of codes and the common set of codes. And what I do at the bottom of this, what I do with that and the enabling part of this and the conforming part of this is the value I store in my core warehouse is only the common code value. If I want to know what that value was in Cerner, I go out to the data table for the encounter, get my X, go back through the bridge table back to the tenant common code, and I know what the value was in Cerner. But the only thing I store in my atomic table is my enterprise accepted, governed, conformed code value. Definitionally, if I implement my atomic model that way, my atomic model data structure is conformed to the codes. The model enables that conformity to be the only thing available to the people that are consume my atomic data. When I want to report on this, the most common way I want to report data is in the context that it was sent to me. So I want to know what hospital system X that happens to use Cerner was reporting as discharge status encounters. How many discharges were there yesterday? I can go back from my atomic table, back through that bridge table to the tenant common code table and report that value on my report. So I can do either conformed enterprise reporting on my code or the context of the tenant that sent it to me. The only other wrinkle to this is there's a lot of code sets that have other data other than the name value pair. Easily the most common ones are common codes. There's just name value pairs. But drug codes, procedure codes, diagnosis codes, order codes, condition codes, right? They're examples of complex codes. And to the degree we were able to model to a standard, apparently RxNorm gave us the rights to a certain amount of their metadata. So we were able to create RxNorm tables. Procedure codes have CPT codes have additional data to them. Drug codes, have all application data sets to them. We were able to model a lot of those as quote unquote complex codes. That just has a bridge table to the common code table, right? That's an addition to the common code table. Everything that's an enumerated value in this model gets an entry as a domain and a code set in the common code table. It just so happens some of them also have a bridge out to other descriptive data. And that is on a case-by-case basis. And one of the things that I did implementing this over the last 15 years is I wrote a document on how to accept new codes. I'll pick on gender codes with all the snickering notwithstanding. There's a lot of different defined code sets for gender anymore. I think the state of New York had like 14 of them back in 2015. Most reporting tools want male, female, and unknown. So what happens if the state of New York sends me a fourth gender code? All right, I wrote a document on how I can indicate that I see a new code and I have to assume the source system is correct, so my data warehousing has to accept it. And then I get a note sent out to the SMEs that are managing this party system and said, okay, I got a new gender code. What do I do with it? And they go out to the common code tables and the tenant common code tables and indicate that's either a valid code, no, by the way, it's called this, or they indicate it's an invalid code. And my data warehouse knows that I have a code that was submitted to me on Tuesday. I send a note out to my SMEs on Tuesday night. Thursday, they get back to correcting that data in the source system. It gets sent back to my data warehouse. Now it has a correct code. My system has a history of the incorrect code, and it has an update of the correct code. That's a basic data warehouse function. So all of that is baked into this code management system in UDMH. Most of this is not stored in the catalog part of a data catalog. There are reference data management tools that will store, and this is what the SMEs have access to. This is where they're changing descriptions, and they're indicating a code is valid. They're adding a new code set that they know a new piece of business is going to show us in 2 weeks. They're managing the reference data management in the governance catalog, in KC or in Purview. The secret to that then is there needs to be some sort of interfacing between the values that are seen in the warehousing data stores I've created from UDMH and my data models and this reference data management tool. But the scale of this effort says you're going to use a reference data management tool. You'll never, 60,000 codes, 20,000 codes, assuming you're going to do an enterprise, 10,000 codes, 500 codes, you're not going to manage that volume of work without a tool. So this has to be managed within a reference data management tool. And you also do not have a choice whether to do it or not. Having a series of different code domain values within a given domain in your core warehouse is unsustainable. You need to conform the code values. So the nice thing about this data too, especially if you're talking about claims, is if you're submitting an 837 form, there is one discharge disposition code set values. There is one experience code, this code, that code. There's like 30 or 40 codes in 837. They have value sets for them. This isn't a profound day-to-day problem. This is a profound month-over-month kind of let's support the business kind of question. And again, UDMH, and I would suggest any model you build out of this, if you can't get a hold of UDMH, needs to have some sort of common code table bridge to a record of what the source system sent us for that code. The actual physical data store up against your data needs to have that. Going out to your data management tool, your reference data management tool, every time you need to look up a code is also usually unsustainable. So essentially you need a replication, a local data store version of that into your data warehouse implementation of your data stores. A lot of codes, critical to the processing of the business, understanding the data. There's no getting around this part of data governance. That is a practical requirement.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of ASCII Anything, brought to you by Moser Consulting. We hope you enjoyed listening to part 2 of our 3-part series with Moser expert John Murphy on healthcare data modeling, interoperability, and governance. Be sure to join us next time as we continue our deep dive with John into the world of healthcare data. Don't forget to share your ideas or suggestions for topics on our social media. In the meantime, please remember to give us a rating and subscribe to our feed wherever you get your podcasts. Until then, so long, everybody.
Go.